Somewhere beneath the sand dunes of the central Sahara, in a corner of Niger that sees almost no rain and almost no visitors, there is a cemetery. Not ruins of a cemetery, not scattered bones that might be coincidence, but an actual burial ground. Graves dug with intention, bodies arranged with care, people placed in the earth the way people are placed in the earth when other people love them. That shouldn't be possible. The Sahara is the largest hot desert on the planet. It is one of the most hostile environments a human being can find themselves in. And yet, beneath the dunes, archaeologists have found evidence of a community that lived beside a lake, caught fish, hunted hippos, and buried their dead with flowers. The question isn't just who these people were. The question is how the world they lived in could have existed at all, and what it means that it vanished so completely that we spent most of recorded history having no idea it was ever there. This is the story of Gobero. The site sits in the Sahara Desert, a particularly stark and empty region within the Sahara, in what is today northwestern Niger. If you went there right now, you would find wind, you would find sand, you would find temperatures that punish you for arriving without preparation. What you would not find is water. You would not find shade in any meaningful sense. You would not find anything that suggests a landscape capable of supporting human life in large numbers, let alone a thriving community complex enough to develop burial traditions. And yet, roughly 10,000 years ago, this place was a lakeshore, not a small seasonal pond, a lake with fish, with crocodiles, with hippopotamuses, with birds and animals drawn to the water's edge, and with people who built their lives around all of it. Gobero is one of the largest and most significant Stone Age cemeteries ever discovered in Africa. More than 200 burials have been identified there across two distinct periods of human occupation, separated by a gap of roughly 1,000 years when the lake dried up and no one lived there at all. The first wave of people arrived around 10,000 years ago. The second came back around 7,000 years ago. Different groups, different burial styles, different relationships with the same patch of earth. What they shared was the lake, and what the lake gave them, which was enough to live and enough to stay. What makes Gobero unusual isn't just that it exists. What makes it unusual is the state of preservation and the intimacy of what was preserved. The desert, which seems like it should destroy everything, actually did the opposite here. The dryness, the isolation, the particular chemistry of the sediment, all of it conspired to hold these burials together across millennia in a way that is genuinely rare. Bone survived, burial position survived. In some cases, the arrangement of multiple individuals in a single grave survived. Archaeologists found a woman buried with her arms wrapped around two children. They found individuals adorned with hippo ivory and shell ornaments. They found bodies laid on flower beds, or at least on what appears to have been vegetation arranged deliberately beneath them. These are not just bodies in the ground. These are moments, frozen moments of grief and care from people who lived 9,000 or 10,000 years ago in a place that no longer resembles anything they would recognize. Now, before we go any further into what was found and what it might mean, it's worth being honest about the limits of what archaeology can tell us. Gobero is remarkable, but it is also incomplete. The people who were buried there left no written records. They left no oral traditions we can trace. We cannot say with confidence what language they spoke, what they called themselves, or exactly where they fit in the complex and shifting picture of African prehistory. Scientists have theories, several of them. Some of those theories overlap, some conflict, and some are still being actively debated. What we can say is what the bones show, what the grave goods suggest, what the environment would have required of the people living in it, and what the climate data tells us about how and why this world appeared and then disappeared. Those things together tell a story that is astonishing, even with all the gaps. Maybe especially with all the gaps, because the gaps remind you that real history doesn't wrap up cleanly. it fades into sand, and sometimes the sand keeps it for 10,000 years before someone comes along and brushes it away. If you are listening to this right now, and you're somewhere comfortable, I genuinely want to know where you are and what time it is. Drop it in the comments. Seriously, there is something about this particular story that I think deserves to be heard at 2 a.m. in a quiet room, or maybe on a long drive through somewhere flat and dark. And if you're listening on Spotify and you want to follow so you get new episodes without the wait, the link is in the description. No ads, no music, just the story. Because this story is worth settling in for. What happened in the Sahara during the early Holocene, roughly 11,000 to 5,000 years ago, was not a minor fluctuation in weather patterns. It was a transformation so total that the landscape became almost unrecognizable compared to what exists today. Rains came, rivers flowed, lakes filled, animals moved in, and then quietly at first and then faster, people followed. They followed the water the way people always follow the water, and some of them ended up on the shore of a lake in what is now Niger, and they stayed long enough to bury their dead, and their dead stayed long enough for us to find them. That is where we are starting. A cemetery in the dunes, and the green world that made it possible. To understand Gobero, you have to understand something that runs completely counter to how we tend to picture the Sahara. The desert as it exists today, the endless sand, the baking emptiness, the silence that feels geological in its weight. That version of the Sahara is not the permanent state of things. It is a phase. And in the early Holocene, it was not the phase the world was in. Around 11,000 years ago, the Sahara was wet. Not damp, not marginally less terrible. Wet. Lakes filled basins that are now dry rock. Rivers ran across terrain that hasn't seen flowing water in thousands of years. Grasslands spread across regions that today support nothing but dunes. There were wetlands, shallow lakes fringed with reeds, and deeper permanent water bodies stocked with fish, and surrounded by the kind of animal life you'd expect in a functioning African ecosystem. Hippos lived where today there is nothing but sand and wind. Crocodiles patrolled waterways that vanished millennia ago. The Sahara, at its greenest, may have looked something like the modern Sahel or even portions of East Africa, a broad savanna landscape threaded with water and alive with movement. The period has a name. Scientists call it the African Humid Period, and it roughly spans from about 11,000 to 5,000 years ago, with the peak of moisture and vegetation somewhere around 9,000 to 7,000 years before the present. Those numbers are important because they anchor what we find at Gobero directly in time. The first people buried there arrived around 10,000 years ago, near the beginning of that humid window, when the lake was new and the grass was spreading, and the entire region was in the early stages of transformation. The second wave came back around 7,000 years ago, closer to the middle of the humid period, when conditions had stabilized enough to support a more settled kind of life. The cemetery sits inside that window like a message in a bottle, and the window itself needs explaining before the message makes any sense. What caused the African humid period? The short answer is orbital mechanics. The Earth's axis tilts and wobbles on long cycles, and around 11,000 years ago those cycles had aligned in a way that shifted how much solar energy the northern hemisphere received during summer. More summer heat over the African and Asian land masses intensified what climatologists call the monsoon circulation. The temperature difference between the hot land and the relatively cooler ocean pulls moist air inward, and when that mechanism is running strong, the rains penetrate much further north than they do today. During the peak of the African humid period, the summer monsoon was pushing rainfall deep into what is now the Sahara, possibly reaching as far as 23 degrees north latitude, which is hundreds of kilometers beyond anything the monsoon achieves in the modern era. The transformation this caused was not subtle, and it was not slow by geological standards. Within a few centuries of the shift beginning, landscapes were already changing in ways that would have been visible within a human lifetime. Sediment cores drilled from lake beds across the Sahara show the transition clearly. Below a certain layer you find desert sediments, wind-blown sands, the chemical signatures of extreme aridity. Then the layer changes. You start finding lake sediments, fine-grained silts deposited by still water, organic material from aquatic plants, the remains of freshwater mollusks and fish bones. Pollen analysis from the same cores adds detail. Species that only grow in moist conditions start appearing in the record. Grasses, shrubs, trees adapted to seasonal rainfall, plant communities that today exist only in regions hundreds of kilometers to the south. Rock art fills in what the sediment cores cannot show. Across the Sahara, from Algeria to Sudan to Niger, there are thousands of prehistoric paintings and engravings on cliff faces and cave walls, many of them depicting animals that require water and vegetation to survive. Cattle, elephants, giraffes, hippopotamuses, crocodiles, people herding animals, fishing from boats, swimming. These are not mythological creatures. They are records of an observed world, a world the people making the art were actually living in. In some cases, the paintings show scenes beside lakes that no longer exist, with species that could not survive in those locations today under any circumstances. The artists were documenting their reality, and their reality was green. When you add all of this evidence together, the sediment cores, the pollen records, the fossil animal remains, the lake shoreline terraces visible from satellite imagery, the rock art, what emerges is a coherent and consistent picture. The Sahara, between roughly 11,000 and 5,000 years ago, was a functioning ecosystem with permanent and seasonal water sources distributed across a landscape that is now almost entirely inhospitable. And that landscape did not just change slowly over millennia. In terms of climate systems, it flipped relatively fast. Some researchers estimate that portions of the eastern Sahara transitioned from near desert to savanna conditions in as little as a few centuries. That is fast enough that a person living in the early transition period might have been born into a marginal landscape and died in a substantially greener one. For human populations in Africa, this mattered enormously. Water is not just something people drink, it is the organizing principle of settlement. In dry landscapes, people move constantly, following seasonal resources, staying close to reliable water points, ranging across large territories to meet basic needs. When water becomes more abundant and more predictable, the entire logic of how people live starts to change. You can stay longer in one place. You can invest in that place. You can learn its rhythms in detail. You can build social relationships that depend on proximity over time. And when water is abundant enough to support large animal populations, the food resources around a permanent lake are genuinely extraordinary. Fish can be caught year-round. Large mammals come to the water's edge on predictable schedules. Birds nest in the reeds. Plant foods grow in the moist soils along the shoreline. The African humid period essentially created a network of viable corridors and habitable nodes across a landscape that had previously been a barrier. The Sahara, in its desert state, is one of the most effective geographic barriers on the planet. It separates sub-Saharan Africa from North Africa and the Mediterranean world in a way that shapes migration, population movement, and cultural exchange at the larger scales. But during the humid period, that barrier became permeable. Water sources formed stepping stones across what had been empty terrain. People could move north, south, east, and west along routes that the desert had previously made impossible, and they did. The genetic and archaeological record from this period shows populations mixing and moving in ways that only make sense if the landscape was actually navigable. Some groups were probably highly mobile even during the humid period, following seasonal rains, tracking animal movements, using the network of lakes and rivers as a travel infrastructure rather than a reason to stay put. Others, when they found a lake stable and productive enough, seemed to have stayed. They kept coming back to the same places. They learned those places, and eventually they started burying their dead there, which is one of the clearest signals that a community has decided somewhere is home. You do not bury your dead somewhere you do not intend to return to. The grave is a claim, a marker, a reason to come back. The lake at Gobero was that kind of place. It sat in a natural basin in the Tenere region of what is now Niger, and during the African humid period it held enough water and enough life to draw people in and keep them. It was not the only lake that formed in the Sahara during this period. There were hundreds of them, some large, some small, some permanent, and some seasonal. But Gobero had something unusual, something that set it apart not just as a place to live, but as a place that would eventually reveal itself to the 21st century as one of the most significant archaeological sites on the continent. It kept what was buried there. But before we can understand what was found, we have to understand how it was found at all, and what it took to get to a place that the desert had been guarding for 9,000 years. Gobero is not the kind of place you stumble across by accident. On a modern map, it sits in the Sahara Desert of northern Niger, in that broad, almost featureless band where the Sahel, the semi-arid grassland fringe to the south, fades upward into full Sahara. If you look at a satellite image, you see this transition as a kind of slow bleaching. South of Gobero there are still hints of vegetation, faint patterns of old drainage lines, a memory of seasonal green. North of it, the surface hardens into a vast sheet of sand and stone, where the eye can travel for tens of kilometers without catching on anything. Gobero lies right in that in-between zone. Not the fertile Sahel, not the hyper-arid central Sahara, but the hinge between them. Today that hinge is dry enough that annual rainfall can be effectively zero. Winds can blow for days. Temperatures swing from baking heat to surprising cold. It is not a place that suggests hidden lakes and ancient cemeteries, and yet that is exactly what is there. The path to Gobero did not begin with someone walking the dunes and kicking a skull out of the sand. It began, like a lot of modern desert archaeology, from above. Researchers scanning high-resolution satellite imagery over the central Sahara weren't looking for people at all. They were looking for water, or more accurately, they were looking for the ghost of water. Dry lakes leave signatures that are strangely durable. Old shorelines can appear as faint arcs or terraces, a subtle step in the ground where waves once broke. In infrared or false-colour imagery, the sediments of an ancient lake bed can stand out against the surrounding desert. Even when everything looks like sand to the naked eye, the chemistry and grain size are different enough that the sensors notice. In the early 2000s, a team focusing on fossil-bearing sediments in the Tenere noticed just such a basin. A pale oval, several kilometers across, ringed by slight rises that, when you trace them carefully, resolved into shorelines. Inside the basin there were low elongated sand ridges, dunes, perched in positions that only made sense if they had formed as wind-piled sand up against the old lake margins. That was Gobero, a fossil lake basin with elevated dunes along what had once been its shoreline, a place where, if people had ever lived by the water, their camps and their graves might have ended up on those slightly higher, better drained patches of ground. There is a reason cemeteries like this can sit undetected for thousands of years in dune fields. Wind is both destroyer and conservator. It moves sand relentlessly, eroding one surface, burying another. A low rise used as a burial ground 9,000 years ago can be scoured down to bone in one phase and then entombed under meters of sand in the next. From the air it becomes just another ripple in a sea of ripples. On the ground, unless erosion has exposed something, it can look like nothing at all. When the first field teams reached Gobero, that was more or less what they saw, an open expanse of sand and gravel, pale and deceptively empty. The old lake bed was obvious enough, a broad, flat depression with different texture and colour than the harder desert surrounding it. The elevated dunes along its margin, though, were ambiguous. They could have been just dunes. The only way to know was to walk. Field archaeology in places like Gobero starts slow. You grid the landscape in your head and then with your feet, moving in straight lines a few meters apart, eyes down, scanning for anything that breaks the uniformity of sand and stone, a flake of worked chert, a fragment of pottery, a snail shell that shouldn't be there, a piece of bone. At Gobero, those first reconnaissance walks began to turn up small but telling clues. Stone tools, debitage from tool making, fragments of pottery sherds weathering out of the surface, pieces of animal bone, all concentrated along certain dune crests and slopes. Once you have surface material, the next step is to see what lies beneath. Archaeologists cut test pits, small, systematically placed holes that sample the subsurface in a controlled way. At Gobero, these pits went down through the dune sands and into older sediments. Layer by layer, the story took shape. Near the base, lake deposits, fine silts, freshwater shells, fish bones. Above that, sand with scattered artifacts, and then, in some places, human bone. Finding a bone in a test pit is the moment everything changes. A flake of stone tells you people were there. A bone, especially a human one, tells you they kept coming back, that there was enough stability, enough attachment to place, that they buried their dead. The shift from survey to excavation is a shift in pace and in mindset. Survey is about covering ground. Excavation is about slowing down, sometimes to the scale of centimetres per day. At Gobero, once burials were identified, archaeologists expanded the pits into carefully mapped units. Each square metre was gridded, each layer recorded, each bone exposed with the kind of patience that looks almost exaggerated until you remember how fragile dry bone can be after thousands of years. Burials in sand can be especially delicate. Sand flows. It fills spaces as you remove it. A careless trowel stroke can undercut a skull or a rib cage and cause it to collapse. So the team at Gobero worked methodically. They brushed, they sieved, they photographed. They logged the orientation of each skeleton, the depth, the position of hands and feet, the presence or absence of grave goods. They mapped the dunes themselves, building a three-dimensional picture of how the cemetery sat in relation to the old lake shorelines and to the fluctuating water levels over time. What the mapping revealed was that Gobero was not a single cemetery frozen in a single moment. It was a place people returned to across different eras of the African humid period. You could see it in the way graves cut into earlier graves, in the different styles of pottery found with different sets of burials, in the radiocarbon dates that clustered into at least two main occupation phases separated by centuries, even millennia. From a distance, all of those graves are just points on a map, dots scattered along the crests and flanks of dunes that once looked out over water. Up close, each dot is an individual, a body laid down with care, in a particular posture, with particular objects, at a particular moment in time. But before we can look at those individuals, we need to understand how archaeologists read this kind of evidence at all, how you look at a skeleton and start to reconstruct not just a cause of death, but a way of life. And we need to come back to a more basic question that hovers over every exposed grave at Gobero. Out of all the possible lake shores in a green Sahara, why this one? What was it about this basin, this shoreline, these dunes, that made generations of people choose to bring their dead back to the same strip of sand, long after the first graves had already been laid down? When archaeologists say this is a grave, they're not just reacting to the presence of a skeleton. Human bodies can end up in the ground in a lot of ways. A person can fall into a depression, and be quickly buried by flood sediment. A flash flood can redeposit bones downstream from where someone actually died. Animals can drag remains into a den. Over thousands of years, all of that can end up looking like a body in the dirt. So the first question at a place like Gobero is very basic. Did someone put this person here on purpose? Intentional burial leaves a pattern. The body is usually in an anatomically coherent position, with the bones still articulated in ways that match a living posture. At Gobero, many of the skeletons are tightly flexed, knees drawn up toward the chest, or extended on their backs with arms carefully arranged. The fingers and toes are often still in place. That only happens if the body was covered relatively quickly, before scavengers and weather could scatter the smaller bones. Then there is orientation. People tend to have ideas about how a body should face. At Gobero, clusters of graves share preferred alignments, heads toward the lake or toward a particular horizon, with bodies parallel to dune crests. Natural deposition is rarely so tidy. If water has transported bones, they sort by size and density, and they pile up in chaotic angles. If wind has exposed and reburied remains, you usually see disarticulated elements at odd depths, not an intact skeleton at one level. Archaeologists also look for the grave itself, the outline of the pit that was dug into the surrounding sediments, in a dune that can show up as a subtle change in sand colour or compaction, a lens where the original layering is interrupted. Sometimes tools leave telltale marks along the sides. At Gobero, many burials are set into deliberately cut hollows in the dune, with sand backfilled around the body. In cross-section, you see the grave cutting through earlier layers like a slice. And then there are the objects. A natural death on a campsite might leave someone where they fell, near discarded tools or broken pots. But a grave with a pot placed at the head, or an arm ring still encircling the radius, or stones laid like a frame around the body, speaks of choices. Several Gobero burials include grave goods and arranged elements that do not make sense as random debris. Someone dug, someone placed, someone closed the pit. Once a burial is recognized, the next question is when. In a desert, where surfaces can be stripped and reworked many times, dates are the anchor for everything else. One of the main tools is radiocarbon dating. Organic remains, bone collagen, charcoal from hearths, bits of plant material, carry a record of radioactive carbon absorbed while they were part of living systems. After death, that carbon starts to decay at a known rate. By measuring how much remains, labs can estimate how many years have passed since that organism stopped exchanging carbon with the atmosphere. At Gobero, radiocarbon samples from human bone, associated animal remains, and short-lived plant materials cluster into distinct ranges. One group of burials consistently yields dates around 9,700 to 8,200 years ago. Another falls later, roughly 7,300 to 4,700 years ago. Those ranges are not exact single years. Each date comes with an uncertainty, a probability curve that might say, for example, this burial is most likely between 8,600 and 8,300 years before present. So archaeologists cross-check. They use stratigraphy, the simple but powerful principle that, in undisturbed sediments, lower layers are older than those above. At Gobero, some graves clearly cut down into others. If an upper burial intrudes into a lower one, it must be younger, even if both date ranges overlap statistically. Pottery styles help too. Sherds found with the older burials have different shapes, tempers, and decorative patterns than those with the later ones. When radiocarbon, stratigraphy, and artifact typology all point in the same direction, the chronology becomes more robust. Environmental data adds another layer. Lake sediments beneath the dunes preserve freshwater snail shells, fish bones, and pollen from plants that once grew around Gobero's margins. These can be dated and compared with regional climate records, cores from nearby lake basins, dust records from the Atlantic, even cave speleothems from farther afield. When the ages of the human burials line up with periods of high lake level, or with phases of known regional humidity, archaeologists gain more confidence that they are situating these people within the right chapter of the Green Sahara story. With time and intention sketched in, attention turns to the bones themselves. Skeletons are not just remains. They are records of a life written in growth and wear. Age estimates start with teeth. In children and adolescents, the sequence of tooth eruption and the degree of root formation offer quite precise age windows. In adults, patterns of dental wear, the closure of cranial sutures, and changes in the surfaces of certain joints, the pubic symphysis, the ends of long bones, can indicate whether a person died in their 20s, their 40s, or later. Sex estimation relies on sexual dimorphism. The pelvis is the most informative. The shape and width of the birth canal, the angle of the sciatic notch, the features of the pubic bone differ statistically between typical male and female anatomies. The skull offers secondary clues: brow ridges, mastoid processes, the robustness of muscle attachments. None of this is perfect. Biological sex and gender identity are not the same, and the skeletal markers themselves come with overlap and error margins. At Gobero, as elsewhere, archaeologists speak in probabilities: probable female, indeterminate rather than absolutes. Health and workload are etched into bone over time. Repeated stresses leave characteristic marks. Enlarged areas where ligaments and tendons anchored, extra bone growths where joints were overloaded, curved or thickened shafts where muscles pulled in the same direction for years. Compression fractures in vertebrae can point to heavy loads or frequent bending. Changes in knee and hip joints can hint at long distances walked or run. At Gobero, patterns of joint wear and spinal changes help suggest what daily labour might have looked like on those lake margins: hauling water, processing fish, grinding grain, carrying game. Trauma stands out too. Healed fractures can show whether someone survived an injury long enough for bone to knit, and whether the alignment was good or poor. Sharp force or blunt force injuries to skulls and ribs can raise questions about interpersonal violence, accidents, or animal attacks. The absence of certain traumas is also telling. A cemetery filled with people who died of old age and illness tells a different story than one dominated by young adults with perimortem wounds. Even diet leaves traces. Microscopic wear patterns on teeth can distinguish between diets rich in tough plant fibers, gritty seeds, or softer animal protein. On a chemical level, the ratios of stable isotopes, different forms of carbon and nitrogen locked into bone collagen, shift according to what types of plants and animals made up most of the person's food. At Gobero, isotope analyses help to quantify how much of the diet came from the lake: fish, aquatic plants, water birds, and how much from terrestrial hunting and gathering on the surrounding savanna. All of this depends on preservation, and in deserts preservation is fickle. Dry sand can be an excellent conservator. It can wick away moisture, limit microbial decay, and protect fragile materials from the chemistry that dissolves bone in more humid soils. A body buried deeply in a stable dune might rest in a kind of natural archive, with even the smallest hand bones intact. But the same sand that protects can also destroy. Wind erosion can strip meters off a dune in a few seasons, exposing bone to intense temperature swings, ultraviolet light, and mechanical abrasion. Salts can crystallize within porous bone, causing it to flake and crumble. Occasional pulses of groundwater can dissolve collagen, the very component needed for radiocarbon dating and many types of isotopic analysis. At Gobero, some skeletons are almost pristine. Others are partial, with ribs and vertebrae gone, skulls collapsed, surfaces exfoliated to the point where fine details are lost. These uneven conditions introduce bias. The individuals we can study best are not necessarily a random sample of everyone who was buried there. Infants' bones are more fragile and less likely to survive. Lightly built individuals may be underrepresented compared to more robust ones. Graves that lay just a little higher on a dune crest might have been eroded away completely long before archaeologists arrived. The cemetery we see is a fragment of a larger whole. The tools used to read that fragment also come with limits. Radiocarbon dates are reported with ranges, not single years, and calibration curves can shift as new data comes in. Sex and age estimates are probabilistic, based on reference populations that may not perfectly match the people of Gobero. Isotopic signatures can be influenced by local ecological quirks that are not fully understood. Two analysts might score the same joint wear or dental pattern slightly differently. This is why interpretations change. As new burials are uncovered, as methods improve, as broader regional datasets accumulate, earlier conclusions are revisited. What once looked like a brief single episode of cemetery use might stretch out into multiple phases. Patterns thought to reflect social inequality might later be reinterpreted as differences between age groups or family clusters. At Gobero, the recognition that there were at least two distinct populations using the same dunes, separated by a long dry phase, emerged only when enough burials, dates, and environmental samples could be compared systematically. Reading burials, then, is an exercise in cautious inference. Each skeleton offers a set of clues: posture, context, wear, chemistry. None of them speak loudly on their own, but when they are assembled into a larger pattern, dozens of individuals mapped in 3 dimensions, anchored in time, cross-checked against lake levels and regional climate swings, they begin to outline the lives of people who never wrote anything down. With those tools in mind, we can return to Gobero's dunes and begin to follow the story as archaeologists see it, starting with the earliest group who found a shore on a green Sahara lake and decided that this was where their dead should lie. When archaeologists talk about the first people at Gobero, they do not mean the absolute first humans ever to walk across that patch of sand. Footprints vanish. Campsites can be erased. A few families might have stopped at the lake for a season, left almost nothing behind, and disappeared into the archaeological dark. What they mean is the first group we can clearly see, the first population whose burials, tools, and dates line up into something more than a scattering of clues. At Gobero, that earliest coherent phase sits in the early Holocene, roughly between 9,700 and 8,200 years ago. Climate records say this was a time when the Sahara was shifting into one of its greenest states. Monsoon rains pushed far to the north. Dunes that had been bare for thousands of years sprouted grasses, sedges, and scattered shrubs. Shallow depressions filled with fresh water, creating chains of lakes across what is now a desert. Gobero was one of those lakes. Not a narrow ribbon of water, but a broad basin, tens of square kilometres in extent when full, fringed by low dunes and marshy margins. In that landscape, a human camp on the shore was suddenly a sensible idea. The bones and artefacts from this first phase suggest a way of life closely tied to the water. Fish bones dominate the animal remains in some levels. Catfish, tilapia, other freshwater species. Many are large individuals, not the small fry that could be scooped up anywhere. Some show cut marks where fillets were removed. Others are found in hearth context with burned edges, traces of roasting. Alongside the fish are water birds, ducks, geese, waders, and turtles. Their shells too bear signs of butchery. On slightly higher ground, antelope and other savanna mammals appear, mixed in with the remains of smaller game. The picture is not of a single specialized food source, but of people who knew how to tap every niche around a productive lake. Fishing in that context was not a casual pastime. A large lake in the middle of seasonally dry grassland is both opportunity and trap. Fish populations boom when waters rise and flood new feeding grounds. They crash when water retreats, when temperatures spike, when oxygen levels in shrinking shallows drop. A group that depended on fish had to think in seasons, in cycles. They would have learned when certain species spawned, when schools moved into inlets, when low water trapped fish in predictable bottlenecks. Nets, traps, or weirs would have multiplied their catch, even if the materials, plant fibres, wooden stakes, have long since decayed. Simple harpoons or barbed points, if present, might be indistinguishable in the sand from ordinary hunting spear tips. The technology could be invisible. The scheduling is not. The sheer volume of fish remains at some early Holocene sites across the Green Sahara, tells us people were planning around lake rhythms, not just opportunistically grabbing whatever swam by. Hunting and gathering on land would have followed similar seasonal patterns. In wet months, game spreads out, scattered across a wide green carpet. In drier intervals, animals funnel toward remaining water, concentrating along the lake margins. Hunters who understood those movements could choose when to pursue dispersed herds in the savanna and when to wait in ambush along well-worn paths to the shore. Plants added another layer. Around early Holocene lakes, grasses and sedges produced starchy seeds. Edible roots and tubers grew in the moist soils of the margins. Fruit-bearing shrubs and trees favoured slightly higher ground, where water tables were accessible but roots were not drowned. Grinding stones from Gobero, some associated with the earlier phase, speak of intensive processing of plant foods, probably seeds or wild grains. Their worn, polished surfaces are the residue of thousands of repetitive motions, turning hard little particles into flour or meal. Taken together, the remains point to a sophisticated mixed economy. Fishing, fowling, hunting and gathering, all synchronized with the pulse of a Saharan lake. Yet these people were probably not permanent lakeshore villagers in the way we might imagine a later farming community. Mobility still mattered. In a landscape where rains could vary from year to year, where lake levels rose and fell, flexibility was insurance. One way to picture it is as a territory with nodes. The lake was a major node, a predictable anchor in an uncertain environment. Around it, groups might have rotated through a set of favoured places, a dune crest that caught evening breezes and offered good visibility, a patch of woodland that produced a reliable fruit crop, a distant outcrop where good stone for tools could be found. Camps could be light and temporary, windbreaks, hearths, scattered tools. The dunes preserved some of this, clusters of stone flakes, the occasional hearth stain, but much disappeared. What endured most clearly were the cemeteries. To modern eyes, a cemetery feels like a permanent claim, a statement that this is our place. For mobile foragers and fishers, it can be something slightly different. A burial ground can be a fixed point in a moving life, a place returned to again and again, even as camps shift with herds and seasons. People might have buried their dead on one particular dune for generations while living months of each year dozens or hundreds of kilometres away. At Gobero, the distribution of early burials suggests precisely this pattern. Graves from the older phase cluster in certain parts of the dune complex. They are not surrounded by dense, thick levels of occupational debris. Instead, domestic traces are more diffuse, hinting that people came, buried, stayed for some time, left, then returned. The lake was not just a pantry, it was also, consistently, the address of their dead. In material terms, this first phase has its own signature. Stone tools tend to be relatively large, with certain shapes and retouch patterns that recur. Scrapers, backed blades and points show a style that fits within the broader early Holocene toolkit of the Central Sahara, but with local quirks, slightly favoured forms, particular ways of thinning or shaping edges. Pottery appears too, already present by the time of the earliest securely dated burials. These are among the oldest ceramics in the Sahara. Thick-walled vessels, often with rounded bases, tempered with grit or crushed rock. Many are decorated with impressed patterns made by rolling cord, dragging comb-like tools, or pressing fingertips around the exterior. Sherds from this earlier phase at Gobero tend to share certain combinations of decoration and form that differ from the later occupation, enough to tell archaeologists that they are looking at a distinct period, but not enough to assign a specific ethnic or linguistic label. That is where caution comes in. It is tempting to look at a cluster of tools, pottery styles, and burial practices and say, this was X culture, as if culture were a fixed named entity floating above the landscape. For Gobero's earliest people, we do not know what they called themselves, what language they spoke, how they divided us from them. The material patterns let us outline a phase, a horizon of shared habits and techniques, not a fully defined identity, so the questions stay open. What exactly drew them here in the first place? Was it the simple fact of water and food in a drying world? Or did Gobero sit at a crossroads between north-south routes, between different ecological zones, between groups with different specialties? Did the lake become, over centuries, more than just a resource, turning into a place of stories, of origin myths, of obligations to return? For the earliest people we can see at Gobero, the lake was a source of life, a predictable patch of green in a capricious climate, but by choosing to place their dead on its dunes, they made it something more, a point of continuity in an unstable world, a water mirror that watched over both the living camps that came and went and the quiet rows of skeletons that stayed. If you walk through the early cemetery at Gobero, on paper at least, one of the first things that stands out is how ordinary many of the burials look. Most of the older skeletons were laid out extended, on their backs, arms at their sides or gently bent, legs straight. Heads usually face roughly the same way, often aligned with the contours of the dune or the imagined shoreline of the ancient lake. There is nothing like the dramatic flexed burials you see in some other prehistoric sites, where bodies are curled tightly as if sleeping. Here, for the most part, people are stretched out, relaxed. That simple pattern already tells us something, even before we reach for interpretation. It means there was a preferred way to do things. Over centuries, different individuals were brought to this dune and positioned in broadly similar ways. That consistency is an observation. What it implies is that burial was not improvised. Someone or some group remembered and repeated a set of gestures. From that point, inferences multiply, but they need to be handled carefully. An extended burial can suggest a concern with how the body looks in death, an idea of the corpse as a person lying, resting, rather than as a bundle or a package. The recurrence of the same basic pose hints at shared norms, a community sense of this is what respect looks like. Whether those norms were backed by elaborate stories about the dead, or simply by habit, we've always done it this way, we cannot say. The bones record posture, not beliefs. Around those bones, and sometimes directly on them, archaeologists found grave goods. Some are utilitarian, stone points, scrapers, blades, the kinds of tools that show up in living camps as well. Others are more clearly ornamental or symbolic. Pendants, beads, worked pieces of bone and tooth. At Gobero, especially in the earlier phase, perforated animal teeth and small ornaments of bone appear in and round burials, sometimes clustered where the chest or neck would have been, as if once sewn onto clothing or strung as necklaces. Again, the facts are straightforward. Objects that could have been left in camp ended up in the ground with the dead. They were placed there deliberately. They did not arrive by accident, swept in by wind. What that means is more speculative. A decorated burial could signal status, a person remembered as skilled or powerful or connected to certain roles. It could mark gender or age categories. It could be less about the dead individual and more about the living. A family demonstrating their care by giving up valuable items or by dressing the body in its best ornaments one last time. There is another possibility that is harder to prove but fits with patterns seen elsewhere in early Holocene cemeteries across the Green Sahara. Some grave goods might be more about memory than use. A well-used scraper, a familiar pendant, a tooth drilled and worn shiny from long contact with skin. These could be pieces of a shared past placed with the dead as a way of anchoring stories. This was hers, she always wore it. The archaeology can register the object. The story it carried is gone. Certain categories of goods sit right at the border between tool and symbol. A finely shaped point, for example, is an instrument, but it is also a demonstration of skill, a visible sign of belonging to a community that knows how to make such things. To bury points with someone is to lose tools, but also perhaps to mark them as a hunter, a fisher, a person who had mastered one of the key tasks that kept people alive around the lake. The care involved in these burials is visible not only in the objects, but in the placement of the bodies themselves. Skeletons lie in shallow pits that follow the shape of the person. Joints are mostly an anatomical connection, which means the body's decomposed in place without being disturbed. Limbs are not twisted or cramped against hard edges. In some graves, hands are placed near the pelvis or gently overlapping, not flung at random. At a few, stones seem to have been set to support or frame the corpse. All of this suggests that the dead were not simply dropped into hurried holes. Someone had time and motivation to dig, to arrange, to pause and decide exactly how the person should lie. They also remembered where earlier graves were. Burials do not routinely cut through one another. The living, each time they came back to this dune, could still read the cemetery enough to avoid disturbing earlier bodies, or to cluster new graves in relation to old ones. Once more, it's important to keep the distinction clear. What we can see, repeated body positions, intact skeletons, goods placed in systematic ways, spatial clustering of graves, avoidance of overlap. What we often infer, ideas of an afterlife, ancestor veneration, ritual prescriptions, even emotional states, those may all be true. People who take this much trouble with their dead tend to be people for whom death has meaning beyond disposal. But the only secure claim is that care was invested and that it was patterned. The cemetery as a whole raises a large question. Why does such a place form at all? For highly mobile foragers and fishers, the landscape is full of options. In theory, they could bury people wherever they happen to be when death occurs. Yet at Gobero, as at a handful of other early Holocene lakeshore sites, we see concentration. Over many centuries, bodies accumulate on particular rises near the water, turning parts of the dune into places that are different from all the others. One explanation is practical permanence. The dunes did not flood. They were dry, slightly elevated, visible from a distance. A good place to dig a grave once could remain a good place for generations, simply because it was stable. Another explanation works in social terms. Returning to the same ground to bury kin can turn geography into genealogy. The dune becomes an anchor of ancestry, a point in space that gathers relationships in time. That, in turn, can shade into ideas of territory. A cemetery does not fence a landscape the way a border does, but it can mark a claim of familiarity. Our dead are here, so we belong here. For people whose lives moved with seasons and resources, that kind of belonging might be expressed less through permanent houses and more through permanent graves. There is also the possibility of a sacred shoreline. Over hundreds of years with each burial, stories might have accumulated, of how the first person was laid there, of how the lake spirit watched over the bones, of obligations to visit, to care, to bring the dying back when possible. None of that is written in the sand, yet the persistent choice to lay bodies by this water, and not some other, hints that the place was more than convenient. It was, in some sense, appropriate. So the early cemetery at Gobero tells a layered story. On the surface, extended burials, simple grave goods, careful placement on a quiet dune. Beneath that, repeated decisions that tied one generation to the next, that turned a productive lake into a landscape of the dead as well as the living. The bones show posture and pattern. The goods show selection and sacrifice. Between them lies the hardest part to see. How these people understood what it meant to lay someone down, face turned toward a lake that had fed them all their lives. Among these careful, mostly individual burials, one grave at Gobero feels different enough that it keeps drawing attention, even on the printed page. It is a cluster of 3 people, an adult and 2 children, laid out together, their bodies overlapping in a way that suggests not chance but choreography. The bones are old, mineral-stained, fragile. Yet the arrangement they hold still whispers of the last time living hands touched them. All 3 lie extended. The adult is on one side, the children close, almost nestled. One small arm stretches across another body. A tiny hand comes to rest where a shoulder would have been. Heads are inclined, not perfectly aligned to some cardinal direction, but turned toward each other, as though caught in a gesture of quiet intimacy. The first question is simple. Did they die together? Archaeologists cannot seat themselves beside the grave as it was opened 10,000 years ago. Instead, they read layer by layer. The sand immediately around the skeletons is examined for interruptions, for faint traces of fill, for any sign that the pit was reopened at a later time. The positions of the bones are mapped in 3 dimensions. Do they interlock in ways that would have been impossible if the bodies had different histories of decay? In this case, the evidence leans toward a single event. The skeletons share the same grave cut. There is no clear secondary intrusion, no tidy slice through older sand to accommodate a later burial. The bones lie in anatomical connection, but also in mutual support. An elbow rests naturally in the curve of another rib cage. The overlap is smooth, without the awkward juxtapositions that happen when a second corpse is manoeuvred around a body that has already collapsed and partly disarticulated. That pattern suggests that all 3 were placed while still whole, still held together by flesh and ligament. Then the sand closed in around them, and they decomposed together, sinking slowly, maintaining their embrace. From there, interpretations branch. One possibility is disaster, a disease that swept through a household, a waterborne illness from the lake, a sudden fever. The adult and children might have died within days of each other. The survivors, stunned, might have decided to keep them together, to open one pit instead of 3. A family unit in life becoming a unit in death. Another possibility is accident, a capsized raft, a treacherous patch of mud near the shore, a dust storm that caught them on the flats. In such a scenario, the same small group might have been lost at once. When they were recovered, the choice to bury them together could have carried a different tone, not of slowly accumulating sorrow, but of a single catastrophic moment that demanded a collective response. There is also a more deliberately ceremonial reading. Even if their deaths were separated by weeks or months, the grave might have been designed as a place of reunion. The pit could have been reopened, the sand cut again to add another body near the first, perhaps wrapped or bound to maintain a close pose. Over time, the 3 would still settle into the layered configuration we see. Here the details matter, and they are subtle. Body orientation can hint at sequence. If one skeleton lies flat and another seems slightly higher, bones resting partly on sand, partly on earlier remains that might point to a staged burial. If one skull is clearly more elevated than the others, or if small bones like fingertips or toe phalanges are missing from one individual but present and undisturbed in another, Those are signs that one body had already decomposed enough to be more fragile when the grave was disturbed again. At Gobero, in this triple burial, the vertical differences are slight. The layering is intimate rather than stepped. That does not prove simultaneous burial beyond question, but it makes prolonged intervals less likely. The grave looks like a single episode in which 3 lives ended up sharing the same final gesture. Grave goods complicate and enrich the picture. Near these intertwined skeletons, archaeologists documented small ornaments and possible tools, though not a lavish array. A few beads, perhaps, scattered around where necks and chests once were. A point here, a shaped fragment of bone there. The distribution is telling. Objects do not cluster heavily around just one body, as if marking a single prestigious individual surrounded by dependents. Instead, items are sprinkled in ways that suggest shared treatment, a kind of collective care. This could mean the grave was about the relationship more than about rank. The adult is not a chieftain with sacrificed retainers. The children are not invisible. They all received some measure of attention. Placing multiple small objects might have been a way of acknowledging each person, even if the goods themselves were modest. Still, almost any social story you attach to that pattern remains speculative. One can imagine a parent and 2 offspring lost in a short span of time, mourned intensely. One can imagine siblings, cousins, any cluster of kin whose ties were felt strongly enough that separation in death seemed intolerable. It could also reflect ideas we only partly grasp, that certain deaths called for group burial, or that particular relationships were ritually affirmed by bringing people together in the sand. Archaeology can trace intention most clearly through constraint. The bodies did not fall where they lay. They were carried to a specific dune, to a cemetery that had already accumulated the dead. A pit was dug deep enough to accommodate 3 extended figures. The corpses were not just stacked. They were arranged so that limbs intertwined, so that faces turned inward. Grave goods, however few, were added. Then the living walked away, leaving no inscription, no spoken explanation that we can recover. What remains is a frozen moment of contact. An adult arm, slight but stronger once, laid so that it almost shields a smaller torso. A child's hand, open on another's ribs. The orientations to the ancient lake, heads not all facing exactly the same way, bodies angled slightly differently from the standard single burials, suggest that, in this case, relational positioning mattered more than perfect adherence to communal norms. We can say, with some confidence, that this was not a hasty disposal in a time of terror, with bodies dumped and forgotten. The care in placement and the absence of jumbled bones argue against that. Yet beyond this, narratives diverge. Perhaps this grave preserves the aftermath of an epidemic that passed through a small group camped by the shrinking or stable lake. Perhaps it marks a tragic day on the water. Perhaps it is a deliberate memorial, an act of bringing the dead together in a single meaningful composition, regardless of how and when each life ended. All of those possibilities fit the patterns in the sand. None can be proved to the exclusion of the others. The triple burial at Gobero is most powerful precisely because it refuses to collapse into a single tidy story. It stands there among the more ordinary graves as a reminder that behind every skeleton count and artifact list, there were entangled lives, and that sometimes the clearest evidence we have is not of what happened, but of how much it mattered to the people who stayed behind long enough to arrange 3 bodies, one last time, on the shore of their lake. If the family grave at Gobero invites us to think about emotions, the bones themselves pull us gently back toward physiology. Under the same dunes, in the same cemetery, the skeletons record a quieter story. What it actually felt like to live there, in those bodies, by that lake. At first glance, the early Holocene people of Gobero look strikingly robust. Many of the adult skeletons from the first occupation phase around 9,700 to 8,200 years ago, belonged to individuals who, in life, would have been tall by any standard. Some men may have stood close to 1.8 meters or more, women not far behind. Long bones are lengthy and well built, with thick shafts, confident muscle attachments, and joints that look ready for work. That kind of stature does not appear out of nowhere. It usually reflects childhoods where, for the most part, growth was not constantly being derailed by famine or unrelenting disease. Children need calories and protein and predictability to reach that kind of adult height. The early Holocene Gobero population seems to have had enough of all three, at least in many years for many people. But enough is not the same as easy. Look closely at those same long bones and vertebrae, and another pattern emerges. There are healed fractures, ribs that knit back together, limb bones with slight bends or calluses where a break mended imperfectly. There are joint surfaces roughened by osteoarthritis, especially in knees, hips, and lower spines. Some vertebrae show compression, the wedge-shaped outlines that hint at years of carrying weight, bending, lifting. Those marks don't read like the aftermath of a single terrible accident. They look more like the cumulative effect of a lifetime spent walking long distances, hauling water, dragging heavy game, grinding grain, working hides. The kind of repetitive, whole-body labour that never quite stops until the day you do. Patterns in the arms and shoulders add more detail. Strong muscle attachments around the upper arm and shoulder blades point toward frequent use of throwing or lifting motions. Forearms and hands show we're consistent with gripping and twisting. Combine that with the toolkits found at Gobero, projectile points, cutting edges, grinding stones, and a picture forms of people whose daily routines involved hunting, but also processing, butchering animal carcasses, preparing fish, pounding seeds or tubers into something more digestible. Yet even here, the skeletons do not all speak with one voice. Some individuals bear the full suite of degenerative changes, heavily worn joints, spinal compression, multiple healed injuries. Others show relatively lighter wear, smoother articular surfaces, fewer traumatic events. That might map onto age. Older bodies have had more time to accumulate damage, but age is not the whole explanation. Some younger adults show heavy strain, some older ones are surprisingly clean. This variation suggests that work, risk, and daily strain were not perfectly evenly distributed, even inside a small community. Certain people may have specialized more in high-impact tasks, repeated spear throwing from the lakeshore, dragging nets or traps, carrying heavy loads over dunes. Others may have spent more time on lower-impact activities, tending fires, crafting tools, preparing food, caring for children and elders. The bones don't give job descriptions, but they do hint at a division of labour more complex than a single, uniform lifestyle. Growth patterns reinforce this unevenness. Anthropologists can read childhood stress in the lines and interruptions of bone development. In some Gobero skeletons, growth seems relatively steady. Long bones reach impressive lengths, and the microscopic structure shows few abrupt pauses. In others, there are subtle indicators that growth slowed or stalled temporarily, likely during episodes of illness, seasonal food shortages, or weaning stress. Taken together, these hints point to a life that was not continually brutal, but punctuated by harder seasons. A generally productive environment, a green Sahara with a reliable lake and surrounding resources, overlaid with the inevitable spikes of drought, disease, or social disruption. Most children made it through with enough nutrition to reach tall adulthood. Some, however, carried the marks of tougher early years in slightly shorter bones or minor irregularities in enamel and bone tissue. Teeth, in particular, are blunt historians. The dental remains at Gobero show significant wear, even in some relatively young adults. The chewing surfaces are ground flat, the enamel thinned or gone in places, dentin exposed. This kind of wear usually means that the food being eaten was not just meat or soft plants, but included hard or gritty components, perhaps unhulled seeds, sandy flour, or foods contaminated with tiny quartz grains from grinding stones. Microscopic scratches on tooth surfaces can reveal direction and pattern of wear, hinting at the textures being chewed. At sites like Gobero, those microtraces suggest mixed diets, animal protein from the lake and surrounding savanna, but also plant foods that required heavy processing. The presence of cavities and abscesses in some jaws indicates carbohydrates, starches, or sugars were part of the regular menu, creating the conditions for tooth decay. Enamel carries stress too. Horizontal grooves, called enamel hyperplasias, mark times in childhood when growth was disrupted, often by malnutrition or serious illness. At Gobero, some individuals show these lines, others do not. Again, the pattern is not uniform. Within the same cemetery, possibly within the same household, some children grew through fairly smooth early years, while others had at least one season where the body had to make a hard choice between survival and perfect tooth formation. Diet then was probably diverse and seasonal. In good years, the lake and its surround might have provided more than enough. Fish, turtles, aquatic plants, grazing and browsing animals, wild grains, fruits, perhaps nuts and roots. In leaner times, people may have leaned harder on stored or fallback foods, drier, harder, more abrasive, less kind to teeth and growing bodies. When you zoom out from individual bones to the whole cemetery, the general impression is of a community well adapted to its environment, but not shielded from risk. They were tall, often powerfully built, capable of intense physical activity well into adulthood. They survived broken bones and lived long enough for arthritis to set in. They ate diets that could support growth and maintenance, but that also carried sand, grit and sugars enough to grind down and rot teeth. And still, the range of experience is wide. Some skeletons speak of long, hard-lived lives, scarred by strain and healed injury. Others are smaller, younger, with only the first hints of wear. Some jaws are crowded with heavily abraded teeth, others lost molars early to decay and infection. The cemetery records lives cut short in childhood, lives that reach the full arc of middle or older age, and everything in between. The temptation is to turn these patterns into certainty, to say that tall stature proves security, that arthritis proves endless toil, that enamel lines prove famine. The reality is more layered. A single lesion can have multiple causes. Genes, disease, climate swings, and cultural habits all press into the same bones, leaving marks that we can read only in outline. Still, those outlines matter. They tell us that the people who buried their dead at Gobero were not abstract hunter-gatherers from an undifferentiated past. They were individuals whose bodies bore the signatures of specific habits, specific choices, specific years when the lake was generous and others when it was less so. Their skeletons are not just remnants, they are records, partial, biased, sometimes smudged, but records all the same, of what it meant to inhabit that shoreline when the Sahara was green. And they set the stage for the next question. If these people were tall, strong, and deeply tuned to their environment, what exactly was that environment offering them? To understand their work and their wear, we have to understand their pantry. At Gobero, that pantry was the lake. If you stood on that shoreline 8,000 or 9,000 years ago and looked around with a hungry stomach, the first thing you would notice is that almost everything you could see was, in one way or another, edible. Start with the obvious. A permanent or semi-permanent lake in the middle of what is now Niger meant fish. At Gobero, the sediments and associated sites have yielded bones and teeth from large Nile perch, smaller catfish, and other freshwater species that like warm, well-oxygenated water. Some of those fish can grow to impressive sizes. A single big perch could feed a small group for a day. Even smaller fish, taken in numbers, become a reliable stream of protein and fat. Fish are only the beginning of a lake's generosity. In the same deposits, archaeologists find turtle shells, crocodile remains, and the bones of aquatic or semi-aquatic mammals. Turtles offer meat and fat wrapped in a kind of ready-made storage container. Their shells at some sites show cut marks from butchering. Crocodiles are more dangerous to acquire, but a successful hunt yields a great deal of meat. Waterbirds, too, ducks, geese, waders, would have flocked to the wetlands, along with their eggs, which are compact packages of fat and protein available in predictable seasons. Beyond the water's edge, the lake drew in larger game. Faunal remains from Gobero and nearby green Sahara sites point to a mosaic of habitats around the shore. Patches of grassland where antelope grazed, slightly higher, drier ground where gazelles and perhaps hartebeest moved in small herds, and bushier zones visited by wild cattle and even hippos where the water was deep enough. The bones of these animals, sometimes bearing cut marks from stone tools, tie the people of Gobero directly to a lakeside menu that included red meat from multiple species. Then there were the plants, which rarely preserve as well but still leave hints. Pollen grains in sediment cores, phytoliths, tiny silica bodies from plants, and the grinding stones found at Gobero all point toward the exploitation of wild grasses and other starchy resources. When you take wild grain heads, pound them on a sandstone quern, and sift the result, a fine flour emerges. But so do invisible grains of quartz that later turn up in toothware. Underground storage organs, tubers, bulbs, rhizomes, thrive in wetter soils near lakes and floodplains. Many are edible once roasted or leached. Fruits and nuts from trees in the slightly higher ground would have added seasonal sweetness and fats. Put all of this together, and the menu along that shore was broad, shifting, and strongly seasonal. Lake levels do not sit still from month to month or year to year. In a green Sahara climate fed by monsoon rains, Gobero's lake would have risen in wetter years, pushing its shoreline outward, flooding low-lying flats, and drowning some plant communities while creating new shallows full of spawning fish. In drier years, the waterline would retreat, exposing mudflats, concentrating fish and turtles in shrinking pools, and forcing grazing animals to walk farther to drink. People living there would have felt these rhythms in their bones. The early rains and rising waters might bring fish moving into newly inundated shallows, ripe for spearing or netting. Certain aquatic plants produce edible shoots at specific water levels. Others set seeds after the floods recede. The egg-laying cycles of waterbirds track these water changes, offering predictable pulses of food. As dry season deepened and the shoreline receded, fish would congest in deeper holes, easier to trap or poison, but some grazing grounds would brown, making large game harder to find or pushing it toward remaining waterholes, where hunting could be both more efficient and more dangerous. Such a world demands timing. You have to know not just what is edible, but when the catfish are most easily speared in shallow water, when certain grass seeds are fully ripe but not yet scattered by wind or birds, when turtles haul out to bask and lay eggs, when antelope shift their migration routes to skirt the lake margin. None of this happens without tools. Gobero has yielded stone points, blades, and other implements that would slot neatly into a lakeside toolkit. Fine, elongated points could serve as barbs on composite fishing spears or arrows. Broader blades might have tipped thrusting spears for larger game. Scrapers and knives were needed to clean fish, skin animals, and slice meat into strips for drying. Actual fishing gear made of perishable materials, nets, wooden fish traps, plant fibre lines, has not survived. but their absence in the archaeological record does not mean they were absent in life. Given the abundance of fish bones and the importance of the lake, it is difficult to imagine these communities relying on hand-catching alone. Simple woven traps set in narrow channels, wicker fences guiding fish into enclosures, or lines with bone or wooden hooks are all well within the technological reach of people who could produce standardized stone points and use grinding stones systematically. Hunting gear, too, was likely varied. Light throwing spears and possibly bows for smaller, fast-moving game closer to camp. Heavier projectiles and coordinated drives for larger animals visiting the lake to drink. The wear patterns on upper arms and shoulders at Gobero match repeated throwing motions. The healed fractures and spinal compression fit with dragging heavy carcasses over uneven ground, hauling water and wood, carrying gear to and from the shore. The beauty and danger of such a place is that when the water holds steady, it lets people thrive. With a reliable lake, families at Gobero could plan. Children could be weaned onto fish and soft plant foods. Seasonal surpluses of fish or meat could be dried in the sun and stored. Stable access to protein and fat supports taller growth, sturdier bones, exactly what we see in many of the early Holocene skeletons. A varied diet of fish, game, grains and tubers spreads risk. If one resource fails in a given year, others can fill the gap. But water reliability is a promise the climate does not always keep. Even in the greenest phases of the Holocene, rainfall across the Sahara pulsed and flickered. Multi-year droughts could lower lake levels, shrink spawning grounds, and wither shoreline plants. Fish bones in the sediment thin out in some layers. Certain lake indicators, shells of freshwater mollusks, particular algae, appear or disappear, marking episodes when the water became shallower, saltier, or more variable. In those times, the laker's larder would have narrowed its offerings. Fish would be fewer, aquatic plants more stressed. Large game might avoid a shrinking muddy basin or crowd dangerously close together at the last waterholes, increasing both hunting opportunity and competition. Groups at Gobero might have been forced to travel farther from shore, experiment with alternative foods, or rely more heavily on stored grains and dried meat. The enamel defects in some children's teeth, the variable growth patterns in bones, are the quiet echoes of those harder years. So the Gobero cemetery, with its tall adults and worn teeth, its healed injuries and occasional stress lines, is in part a record of how completely people can weave themselves into a watery landscape, and how tightly their fortunes are tied to its moods. When the lake was full and generous, it fed bodies and allowed communities to invest in rich social lives, complex burials, and long-term attachment to place. When it faltered, it forced hard choices: move, adapt, or endure the lean seasons and hope the rains returned. That tension between abundance and fragility, between a lake that can be pantry, highway, and gathering place, and a lake that can vanish, is what makes Gobero's story more than a tale of ancient menus. It sets up the deeper mystery of the site, why a cemetery so carefully used and revisited across centuries sits today beside a basin of dust. Archaeologists first realized Gobero held more than one story when the patterns stopped lining up. At the base of the dunes, in the oldest cemetery layers, most of the graves belong to those tall, robust people you've already met. Broad chests, long limbs, powerful muscle attachments, skeletons that match a forager's life built on heavy workloads and generous protein. Their graves trace roughly between about 9,700 and 8,200 years ago, during one of the wettest windows of the early Holocene. Their pottery shares a particular style. Their tools cluster into a recognizable toolkit. Their burials follow certain rules. Then, higher up the dune, in younger layers, the rules change. The bodies are shorter, more lightly built. The grave goods look different. The pottery has new shapes and decorations. the stone tools shift in style. There is still a lake, still a cemetery, still people drawn to this same patch of shore. But the cultural fingerprints are no longer the same. This is what archaeologists call a later occupation phase. Not just more of the same people buried over time, but a second act separated from the first by silence in the record. You can see that difference in the burials themselves. In the older phase, many graves contain individuals laid on their sides or backs, knees loosely bent, often facing the pale shoreline. Some are sprinkled with grave goods, stone points placed near hands, ornaments around the neck or wrists. The famous triple burial of an adult woman and 2 children, all carefully arranged together and dusted with pollen from flowers, belongs to this first era. In the younger phase, roughly 7,000 to 4,800 years ago, bodies tend to be laid out differently. More are extended, arms at the sides or crossed, legs straight rather than flexed. Some are oriented along slightly different axes. The grave shafts sometimes cut through older sand layers that had blown over the earlier cemetery, telling you that by the time these people dug their pits, the landscape had shifted. Their material world had shifted too. Early Gobero pottery is thick, with rounded profiles and a distinct kind of dotted decoration impressed into the wet clay. Later pottery at the same site is often thinner, shaped differently, and decorated with other patterns. It doesn't look like a slow evolution of style. It looks like a new tradition walking onto an old stage. The stone tools tell a similar story. In the earlier phase, broad-backed microliths and heavy points fit a generalized hunter-fisher lifestyle. In the later phase, you start seeing forms associated in the broader Sahara with more specialized equipment, sometimes interpreted as linked to people herding animals as well as hunting and fishing. The toolkit is still forager's gear, but it points towards slightly different priorities, slightly different tasks. So what happened? Did the original Gobero community simply change over time, reshaping its traditions as the climate shifted and social contacts expanded? Or did one group leave and another arrive later, drawn like their predecessors to the same reliable basin? Archaeology can't answer that with absolute certainty, but it can outline the possibilities. One scenario is continuity with change. In this view, the people who buried their dead at Gobero in the earlier Holocene never vanished completely. Perhaps they moved their camps away from the lake during a drier spell, returning generations later with new ideas, new tools, and new customs learned from neighbours. Over centuries, even a continuous population can transform its material culture beyond easy recognition. Language shifts, religious beliefs evolve, burial rites change, pottery styles move in and out of fashion. The bones might still be the descendants of those tall fishers and hunters, but their traditions would no longer look the same. Another scenario is replacement. Here, the story runs differently. As the African monsoon weakened around 8,000 years ago, lake levels at Gobero fell. The basin may have become too shallow, too salty, or too unreliable to sustain a permanent or semi-permanent community. The people who had woven their lives into its shoreline withdrew, following game and water into more stable refuges. For centuries, maybe longer, the dunes stood quiet. Then, as climate pulses briefly improved conditions again, a different population arrived. They found a basin that could still hold water, a landscape that could still offer fish and game, and perhaps faint wind-smooth traces of earlier human presence. They began to bury their dead in the same dune, under the same sky, but with customs and tools shaped by a different history. There is also a third, messier possibility: mixture. Sahara archaeology shows that when the desert was green, people moved. Groups met, intermarried, absorbed strangers, split apart. A drying spell around Gobero could have pushed local families to join with neighbours who had their own burial traditions and pottery styles. When the lake refilled enough to be attractive again, this blended community might have returned, bringing a hybrid set of practices. Some elements of the old Gobero culture would survive in small details. Others would be overwritten by new ways. Climate is the quiet engine behind all three scenarios. Sediment cores and lake indicators suggest that after the rich, early Holocene phase, Gobero's lake level dropped significantly. Shells from certain freshwater species disappear. Layers of wind-blown sand interrupt the lake deposits. That means periods when water retreated and dunes advanced, covering earlier surfaces, including parts of the fur cemetery. For people, that kind of environmental shift doesn't just change where you fish. It changes where you live, where you can stay through the dry season, whether your children can survive a string of bad years. When conditions later improved enough to draw people back, the past was literally under their feet, but perhaps just out of sight, buried by sand. So when you look at Gobero's cemetery today, you're not seeing a single, unbroken story. You're seeing two main chapters separated by a gap, each with its own actors, its own rituals, its own relationship with the same fickle lake. And that sets up the central question that haunts the site. Those later skeletons, with their different heights and burial poses, their new ornaments and pots, are they the grandchildren of the first Gobero fishers, carrying forward a lineage that bent but did not break under climate stress? Are they complete newcomers, people whose ancestors had never seen this lake before they camped beside its shallows and dug into its dunes? Or are they a layered mix, old bloodlines folded into new communities, memories of earlier worlds surviving only as half-remembered stories told around fires while the night wind moved across the sand? The bones, the tools, and the sediments give us boundaries and dates, hints of continuity and change. But inside those boundaries, the people themselves remain elusive. In the next part of the story, the question of who they were becomes even sharper as we look at what Gobero can tell us about identity without names, and how much of a vanished world can be reconstructed from a cemetery in the dunes. When you stand in front of a Gobero skeleton, even in your imagination, it's tempting to start assigning labels. You see long limbs and robust bones, and you want to say, these were tall fishers, a distinct people. You see a shorter, more gracile frame in a later grave, and you reach for words like newcomers or herders. We're used to thinking in tidy categories: ethnic groups, tribes, even races. We're used to maps with coloured areas and clear borders. Gobero will not give you that. Bones and artifacts can tell you many things. They can speak about diet, workload, age at death, patterns of injury and healing. They can hint at family relationships through shared traits, show you how often people use their teeth as tools, how much stress their joints carried. With enough burials, you can even start to see population-level patterns, average stature, common body proportions, the range of variation in a group. That's what archaeologists mean by biological affinity. It's not a modern identity label. It's a way of saying, these individuals share certain measurable traits with other groups from this region and time, or their skeletons look statistically a bit different from these others over here. At Gobero, the early cemetery phase shows people who were, on average, unusually tall for the early Holocene, men often around 1.8 meters, women not far behind, long-legged, heavily built, with muscle attachments that testify to intense physical activity. The later cemetery holds more moderately sized bodies, still robust by modern standards but generally shorter, with somewhat different proportions. Those differences matter. They suggest that we're not just looking at the exact same biological population drifting slightly across time. They hint at either new people arriving or a complex history of mixture and change, but they don't map cleanly onto any simple picture like population A versus population B or locals versus migrants. The sample is small. The range of normal human variation is wide, and bones alone cannot tell you how these people thought about themselves. You can't look at a femur and see a language. Whatever these people called themselves, whatever words they used to distinguish us from them, whatever songs or origin stories they told around the lake, are gone. Spoken language leaves almost no trace at Gobero's time depth. We're dealing with burials that in calendar years sit around 9,700 to 8,200 and 7,000 to 4,800 years ago. The oldest known written texts on Earth are still millennia in the future. There are no inscriptions, no names carved into grave markers, no glossary hidden in the sand. Ethnicity is just as invisible. In the modern sense, ethnicity is a bundle: language, shared history, stories of common origin, often dress, diet, ritual, and sometimes notions of territory or ancestry. Archaeology can sometimes glimpse parts of that bundle: patterns in pottery, ornaments, house forms, burial customs. At Gobero, differences in pottery style, tool types, and burial posture almost certainly reflect cultural distinctions. They tell us that people in the earlier phase had one set of learned behaviours and symbolic preferences, and people in the later phase had another. But what those styles meant to them is harder to reach. Did a particular dotted clay design at Gobero mark membership in a named group, like a clan emblem? Or was it simply what everybody did at that time, the local equivalent of a fashion trend? Did a certain way of orienting the body in the grave encode beliefs about the afterlife? Or just follow a custom whose original meaning had already blurred? We can say there were cultural differences. We cannot reliably say, this is Group X, in the way people often want. We certainly cannot map Gobero neatly onto any named community known from much later historical records. Ancient DNA holds out the promise of sharper answers. In principle, genetic data can tell you how closely related Gobero's people were to other ancient populations across the Sahara and beyond. It can test ideas about continuity versus replacement. It can show whether the tall early foragers and the later, shorter cemetery population were part of one long mixing lineage, or whether a distinct genetic break separates them. In practice, the Sahara is not kind to DNA. High temperatures, fluctuating moisture, and chemical processes in the soil break down genetic material over thousands of years. Some early Holocene skeletons from North and East Africa have yielded partial genomes, but success is uneven, and every attempt involves destroying tiny amounts of irreplaceable bone or tooth. That raises ethical questions. Whose ancestors are being sampled? Who gets to decide how much data justifies the loss? As of now, Gobero's story is still told mainly through bones, artifacts and sediments, not through genomes. One day, carefully targeted sampling might let researchers place its people more clearly within the genetic mosaic of early Holocene Africa, showing links to other Green Sahara sites, to populations along the Nile, or to groups farther south in the savannas. But even if that happens, DNA will not answer every question. It can tell you how people were related. It cannot tell you what they called themselves, or which gods they feared, or who they thought of as strangers. So instead of one definitive identity, Gobero invites you to imagine several grounded possibilities. In one model, the early and late cemetery users are both part of a wide regional network of Green Sahara foragers. Think of small bands moving seasonally between lakes and wetlands, meeting periodically to exchange spouses, tools and stories. In this view, Gobero is one node in a loose web stretching across what is now Niger, Chad, Libya and beyond. Differences in pottery and burial style might arise at the level of bands or regional traditions, with people who are biologically and linguistically close, still maintaining distinct local customs. In another model, larger-scale migrations play a bigger role. As the African monsoon shifted and some basins dried while others filled, Whole communities might have moved hundreds of kilometres chasing reliable water. Gobero's second cemetery phase could reflect a population whose distant roots lay in another part of the Sahara, or even along early corridors toward the Nile or Lake Chad. They might have arrived with a partially different genetic background, different myths, and a toolkit honed in different wetlands, grafting their story onto an old landscape whose first inhabitants were remembered only as traces in the sand. A third model emphasizes cultural exchange over mass movement. Here, Gobero's people are embedded in a network where ideas travel faster and farther than bodies. A few marriages, a handful of visitors bearing new pottery designs or burial practices, a small group of outsiders joining a resident community over several generations. These can transform the visible culture of a place without dramatic replacement. The biological continuity might be strong, but the way people dress their dead or decorate their pots could still shift dramatically. Reality was almost certainly some shifting combination of all three: regional networks, migrations, and constant exchange, playing out over centuries in a landscape that itself would not sit still. When you look at the Gobero cemetery, it's easy to want a simple answer to who were they? The evidence insists on something quieter: patterned bones, patterned objects, patterned sands, all pointing to real communities with real identities that do not line up neatly with our modern boxes. They had names for themselves. They had words for neighbours and strangers. They told stories about where they came from and where they belonged. Those stories have not survived. What has survived is enough to know this. They were not an anonymous blur. They were distinct, changing, interconnected people living through a time when the Sahara was green and alive. And that green world, the one that drew them to Gobero's shore and sustained them long enough to fill its dunes with their dead, did not last. To understand what happened to their lake and to their fragile hold on this place, you have to watch the climate change again. The phrase Green Sahara sounds almost magical, like a brief exception to some timeless desert rule. In reality, it was one phase in a long, restless cycle. For most of the last few million years, North Africa has swung back and forth between wetter and drier states, paced by slow changes in Earth's orbit. As the planet wobbles on its axis and its path around the sun shifts, the amount and timing of solar energy hitting the tropics changes. That, in turn, strengthens or weakens the African monsoon. When the monsoon intensifies, moist air from the Atlantic and Indian Oceans pushes farther north. Rainfall increases. Rivers that were seasonal become permanent. Basins that once only held dust begin to collect water. Grasslands spread into what are now dunes. This is when lakes like Gobero's fill, and when fish, crocodiles, hippos, and people follow. When the monsoon weakens, the opposite happens. The humid period that made Gobero possible begins somewhere after 11,000 years ago, and is well established by around 9,700 to 9,500 years ago. By 6,000 to 5,500 years ago, that favourable configuration of Earth's orbit is already sliding away. The monsoon belt pulls back toward the equator. Rain becomes less reliable, then rare. Patches of wetland shrink. The green gives ground, slowly and unevenly, to desert. The important part is the tempo. From a satellite view of 10,000 years, it looks like a broad curve, wettest around the middle Holocene, drier toward the edges. From the perspective of a community living by a lake, it comes as a series of human-scale events. A few years of failed rains, a decade when fish are scarcer, a generation that grows up with stories of a bigger lake that their grandparents knew. In a basin like Gobero's, the physics of that shift are brutally simple. A lake with no major river constantly feeding it depends on a balance between what falls from the sky and what leaves through evaporation and underground seepage. As regional rainfall decreases, water levels drop. Shorelines retreat. Shallow coves where people once waded to cast nets become dry flats. Reeds die back. Mudflats crack. Chemistry piles on top of that. Every year, tiny amounts of dissolved salts wash into the lake from the surrounding rock and soils. In a wet climate, those salts are diluted or flushed away through overflow. In a drying climate with no outlet, evaporation concentrates them. The water becomes harder, then brackish, then, in some basins, truly saline. Different species drop out at different thresholds. Freshwater plants decline first. Some fish hang on, others cannot reproduce. Amphibians vanish. Snails and mollusks that once littered the shore as shells become rarer, then disappear from the accumulating sediments. Crocodiles and hippos, animals tied to permanent freshwater, either move away or die out locally when the lake shrinks below what they need. The sediment under your feet records this retreat. In the oldest Holocene layers at Gobero, you find evidence of deep fresh water. Particular freshwater snail species, fish remains, pollen from aquatic and shoreline plants. Higher up, as you move into younger deposits, roughly after 8,000 to 7,500 years ago in that region, you see more signs of fluctuating and shallower conditions. The exact local sequence is still a subject of study, and not every core tells the same story, but the general pattern is clear across the central Sahara. Lakes peak in size in the early Middle Holocene, then enter a phase of instability and decline. Eventually, many vanish entirely. At Gobero, the gap between the early tall foragers and the later cemetery users probably overlaps with one of these dry pulses. The dates are not razor sharp, but it looks as though the lake environment that had supported those first burial users around 9,700 to 8,200 years ago deteriorated enough that people stopped using the site. For perhaps 1,000 years or more, Gobero's shoreline lay quiet or was visited only sporadically. Then, as climate flickered back towards somewhat wetter conditions in parts of the Sahara, around 7,000 years ago, people with a different toolkit and somewhat different bodies began to bury their dead there again. By that time, in other basins, some groups were experimenting with herding cattle and goats, or shifting their seasonal circuits to catch what remained of the green. Because climate change never acts alone. As rainfall patterns shift, human communities find themselves facing constrained choices. You can stay and adapt to a smaller, more variable lake, diversify your foraging, rely more on plants, trap smaller and more unpredictable fish, dig wells in the receding shore. You can intensify mobility, stretch your seasonal round farther, link up with more distant waterholes, become more dependent on knowledge of where to find scattered springs. Or you can leave. These aren't all or nothing decisions made in a single year. They play out over generations. One band might start spending only part of the year at Gobero, then skip some seasons entirely. Young people might marry into groups who range farther south or east, carrying with them memories of a home whose shore is now dust. A place that once supported dense burial use a few centuries earlier becomes a marginal stop, then a story, then nothing. If you could watch that process from the point of view of the ground, it would look like abandonment in slow motion. In the lower cemetery, graves cluster near what was then the active shoreline, with overlapping use over centuries. Above them, in the sand, there might be a thin scatter of hearths or tools marking brief visits, then nothing at all for a long stretch. Higher still, a new cluster of graves appears, with different body postures, different ceramics, a slightly different relationship to the now altered lake. What you do not see is a neat line that says, "On this date, the green world ended." Instead, you see discontinuities, a break in burial use, a change in fauna, a new pattern of wind-blown sand over the old lake beds, micro-layers that speak of exposed, drying surfaces instead of constant standing water. You see hints that people came less often, then stopped coming entirely, long before the modern dune sea fully took over. By around 5,000 to 4,500 years ago, the wider picture is unmistakable. Across much of what is now the Central Sahara, lake sediments give way to windblown sands. Pollen records show a sharp decline in grasses and trees and a rise in desert shrubs. The African humid period is effectively over. What you and I would recognize as the Sahara, hyper-arid, vast, hostile to permanent settlement, takes its modern shape. Gobero's dead lie caught on the slope of that transformation. They were buried in a landscape that was already fragile, already subject to climate's long, slow withdrawal. The ending of their green world is written not in a single catastrophe, but in the drawn-out retreat of water, the salt left behind, and the silence that follows when people finally stop coming to the shore. So if Gobero falls silent, the lake dries, and the dunes begin their slow march. What happens to the people? One tempting answer is the bleak one. They vanish with the water. But that's rarely how human stories end, especially in landscapes with options on the horizon. When the last reliable pools disappear from a basin like Gobero's, the surrounding map does not simply turn blank. To the east, far beyond the low ridges and gravel plains, lies the Nile corridor, a ribbon of permanent water sustained by rains far to the south. To the south and southwest, during the late Green Sahara, there were still belts of seasonal rivers and floodplains feeding into what we now call the Sahel, the band of semi-arid grassland that runs along the southern edge of the desert. To the north and northeast, other basins, some higher, some deeper, held on to their wetlands a little longer. The most realistic paths of dispersal for people leaving Gobero thread their way along these still-living veins. Imagine you grow up on the shores of a shrinking lake. Your elders tell stories of a wider water, of hippos that no child in your generation has ever seen. Each year, the walk from camp to the water's edge gets just a little bit longer. Fish are smaller. Nets come up light more often. You start hearing more and more about places over there where the rains have not failed as badly. A cousin marries someone whose family moves between your lake and a more distant river. A brother spends a season away and comes back with a new style of pottery, a new way to have to spear, stories of a floodplain where cattle graze. Leaving doesn't have to mean a single, desperate trek. It can mean stretching your seasonal round outward, year by year, until the lake that once anchored your calendar becomes just one stop among many, then an optional stop, then a memory. The nearest long-term magnet would have been the band of wetter Sahelian zones to the south, around 5,000 to 4,000 years ago, while central basins like Gobero were losing their water. Regions farther south still supported rivers, gallery forests and grasslands thick enough to sustain herds. Archaeological sites scattered across what are now Niger, Chad and northern Nigeria show evidence of exactly this kind of shift. Communities that once left their marks along Paleo-lake margins later show up farther toward the Sahel, with toolkits gradually reflecting more herding, plant use and flexible mobility. Farther away, the Nile keeps drawing people like a gravitational force. In the eastern Sahara, sites that were once organized around lakes and seasonal streams show a similar pattern. As local water failed, groups either intensified their mobility between remaining oases or drifted generation by generation toward the river. By the time Egyptian state societies begin to crystallize along the Nile after about 5,000 years ago, the valley has already been accumulating people from the desert flanks for centuries. Gobero's people could easily have been part of a Western version of that story, their descendants folded into denser populations along still viable Sahelian rivers or more distant basins that remained wet longer. We do not have a neat line of artifacts tracing specific individuals from one named site to another. What we have instead are broad consistencies, ceramic traditions that echo across distances, stone tool types that appear and reappear along different paleolakes, hints that the same general ways of living are being reassembled in new places as old lakes die. Cemeteries themselves tell a quieter part of this migration story. A burial ground is not abandoned only when the last living person dies. It can stop being used long before that, even while a community persists somewhere else. All it takes is a shift in where people think home is. If a group that once circled around Gobero starts spending more of the year dozens or hundreds of kilometers away, their sense of attachment can stretch. Children are born who have never camped by that particular shore. The stories they hear about it are second-hand. When a death occurs, carrying a body back across a now hostile, unreliable landscape may not feel worth the risk or effort. New cemeteries form closer to the new centres of life. Old ones become places of pilgrimage for a while, then pure memory, then vanish from living maps. Cultural memory has its own half-life. A place can remain sacred for generations after people stop visiting it, then slip into legend, then silence. The burials at Gobero mark a node in that process, not its end point. The end of burial used there is evidence that people stopped anchoring their identities to that lake, not that every one of them perished on its shores. When archaeologists compare Gobero to other Green Sahara cemetery sites, a pattern emerges, but it's patchy and uneven instead of uniform. In the central Sahara, at places like Wadi Tanazuft in Libya, or the large lake basins of Chad, we see multiple phases of occupation separated by gaps. Early Holocene foragers bury their dead near rich shorelines. Then there's a hiatus. Then later groups, sometimes with evidence of cattle or new pottery styles, reuse the same general regions under different environmental conditions. No two sites have exactly the same sequence. Some lakes shrink faster, some slower. Some shores host elaborate cemeteries, others only scattered burials or campsites. But the overall impression is not of a continent-wide extinction so much as a complicated reshuffling. Populations thin out in the interior as local water disappears, thicken along more reliable corridors, and reconfigure their social worlds in the process. Those corridors later become the skeleton of trade. By the late Holocene, camel caravans are crossing parts of the Sahara, and trans-Saharan routes move salt, gold and people between the Mediterranean and the Sahel. Many of those later routes run along the same basic lines of least resistance that earlier foragers and herders would have used: chains of oases, low passes through rocky massifs, sequences of former lakes and river valleys. What appears, much later, as a desert highway for merchants may have started as a loose string of seasonal camps and remembered waterholes used by communities like those of Gobero. Thinking about those later trade corridors helps reframe the question of where Gobero's people went. They did not vanish into an undifferentiated desert. They likely flowed along emerging paths that would, thousands of years later, be formalized and intensified by pastoralists and traders. Their knowledge of passes, wells and storm patterns would have been part of the deep background that made those later movements possible. In this sense, the disappearance of Gobero's cemetery is less an ending than a transformation. The tall fishers and later herders who buried their dead in that sand did not leave us written chronicles of where they went. Their languages are lost, their names unrecoverable, but their genes may live on, diluted and reshaped, in the people who inhabit the Sahel and Nile regions today. Their habits of seasonal movement may be echoed in later pastoral circuits. Their sense of where water might be found and how to live when it retreats is part of the long learning curve that allowed humans to occupy even the marginal edges of the Sahara. When you walk through Gobero in your mind now, you're seeing only one frame in a much longer reel. The graves mark a place where strands of ancestry briefly come into focus and then blur again as they flow outward, toward the Nile, along Sahelian rivers, into surviving wetlands that held out a few centuries longer. They did not simply stop existing. They stopped being visible to us in that particular spot. Beyond the last graves, the story continues off stage, carried by people whose bones were laid down in other cemeteries we have not yet found, along river banks that are now dust, in landscapes where the green held on just a little longer before the desert finally won. If Gobero's people didn't stop existing, only stopped being visible in that one place, the obvious next question is, why can we see them there at all? Why this cemetery in this basin, when so many other traces of the Green Sahara are either faint or gone? The answer lives in the quiet, patient work of the desert itself. Not all landscapes treat the dead the same way. Some are generous archivists, others are ruthless editors. Gobero sits in a kind of sweet spot. During the Green Sahara, it was wet enough to support life, but not so wet that bones dissolved quickly. Later, when the lake dried and dunes advanced, the sand did something paradoxical. It buried the graves, but in doing so, it protected them. In archaeology, there's a word for this whole long story of what happens to remains after death: taphonomy. It covers everything from how a body is placed in a grave to how it decays, to how wind, water, animals and chemistry slowly alter or destroy what's left. At Gobero, taphonomy has been unusually kind. Fine sands blown off the dry lake bed settled over the cemetery in gentle layers. They filtered water instead of channeling it. They excluded sunlight. They insulated bones from rapid changes in temperature. In some places, the water table stayed just low enough that graves weren't constantly flooded and leached of minerals. On top of that, the area doesn't seem to have been heavily disturbed by burrowing animals after the desert fully took hold. All of this meant that when archaeologists brushed back those sands thousands of years later, they sometimes found skeletons still articulated, still lying more or less as they had been placed. Joints intact, delicate bones of hands and feet still in order, even in a few rare cases impressions of soft tissues or traces of grave mats. But this level of preservation is the exception, not the rule. Shift the balance a little, move the cemetery closer to a shifting channel, or raise the water table, or add more burrowing rodents, and the story is very different. Wind, which at Gobero eventually turned protector, can be a destroyer first. Before bones are fully buried, sand blasting rounds and thins them. Once exposed, sun and temperature swings make them brittle. If dunes migrate aggressively, they can scour shallow graves, scatter bones, and then recover the area with a clean, anonymous surface. To a future visitor, it looks undisturbed. The damage is hidden, water is equally double-edged. A rising water table can soak bones in mineral-rich groundwater, leading to excellent fossilization. Or it can alternately wet and dry them, leaching out minerals until they crumble. A flash flood across a lakeshore cemetery can cut through graves, roll bones downslope, and redeposit them in jumbled piles far from where they started. A later flood can remove even those. Animals add another layer of editing. Hyenas, jackals, vultures, and large herbivores trampling through wetlands all leave their mark. They can drag bones away from graves, chew them, break them, or simply mix them into the general debris of shoreline life. Burrowing rodents or insects can undermine skeletons from below, collapsing them long before any gentle sand layer has a chance to seal them in place. All of these forces operate unevenly across a landscape. One low rise becomes a long-term archive. Another, only a few hundred meters away, becomes a palimpsest of partial bones and lost graves. A slight difference in elevation, slope, or soil chemistry can mean the difference between a cemetery that survives and one that vanishes almost without a trace. This unevenness is why Gobero feels both incredibly rich and strangely incomplete. The cemetery has given us dozens of burials from two main occupation phases. We can see tall, robust fissures carefully laid to rest. We can see later herders, often smaller in stature, sometimes buried with different grave goods and orientations. We can read age, sex, patterns of wear and injury. We can infer cautiously something about diet and workload, but set those detailed bones against what's missing, and the gaps are still enormous. Where are the settlements that went with these graves? We have scattered hearths, bits of ash, clusters of tools, but not the dense stratified camp layers that would let us trace daily life year by year. Organic materials that would have told us about clothing, baskets, wooden structures, and plant use are mostly gone. The lake bed and surrounding dunes didn't preserve textiles or leather the way very dry caves or waterlogged bogs sometimes do. Firewood, that everyday necessity, has disappeared into ash and dust. The cemetery itself is likely only a fraction of what once existed. Archaeologists have mapped and excavated limited areas, working within strict time, funding, and preservation constraints. Large portions of the site and the basin as a whole remain unexcavated. Some are still buried under meters of sand. Others have already been disturbed by erosion or human activity. Every trench that is opened is a trade-off. What we choose to uncover now means something else stays hidden for future methods, or is left to the desert's discretion. That brings us to a quieter but important layer of the story: ethics. Excavating a cemetery is not just a technical process. It is decision about how to treat the dead. At Gobero, researchers have had to balance curiosity with restraint. Each burial is not simply a data point, but a person who was mourned, prepared, and placed by people who cared about them. Choices about whether to excavate a grave, how fully, and what to sample for scientific analysis are all made with an awareness that digging is permanent. Once a burial is removed from its resting place, it cannot be put back in the exact same way. There's also the question of where those remains go. Some Gobero skeletons and grave goods are curated in museums and research institutions, where they can be studied and preserved under controlled conditions. That, ideally, allows for careful documentation, reanalysis with new techniques, and public education. But it also raises questions about ownership, representation, and the relationship between modern communities, national heritage authorities, and the ancient dead whose bodies are now stored in cabinets far from their burial dunes. Good stewardship tries to keep all of this in view at once: the scientific value of the remains, the dignity of the individuals, the rights and interests of the countries and communities whose land holds these cemeteries, and the unknown needs of future researchers who might learn things we can't yet imagine. Before we go deeper, a brief pause for something a bit more practical. If you're enjoying walking slowly through this kind of deep time mystery, there's a book that expands on stories like this one in much more detail. You can find it at sleepytimehistory.com, and for this week there's a discount available there. If you'd like something to read at your own pace, with even more of these quiet archaeological puzzles, that's the place to look. Then we come back to Gobero, and to the silence between the graves. We have enough bones to sketch health patterns, enough tools to outline subsistence strategies, enough dates to see two distinct eras of use. But we are still missing their houses, their songs, their arguments, their daily jokes. We don't know the exact sound of their language, the small rituals they used to calm children, the stories they told about the lake's moods. The desert has kept the framework, the skeleton of a population's presence, and erased most of the soft tissue of culture that once animated it. Yet even these partial remains are not static. As methods improve, we can coax more information out of what has survived. A fragment of tooth enamel can hold clues about childhood diet and movement. A microscopic scrape pattern on a tool can reveal how it was used. Traces of pollen in sediment can reconstruct pieces of the vanished shoreline vegetation. Gobero is both a gift and a reminder. A gift in how much it has preserved, a reminder in how much it has decided not to keep. The next question is what we can do with what is left. How far we can responsibly stretch from bones and broken pots to stories about the people who lived, fished, laughed and grieved on those long-gone green shores. When we pull back from the individual graves and look at Gobero as a whole, a few things feel solid under our feet, even in all this shifting sand. We know that for a long window in the early and middle Holocene, roughly between about 9,700 and 4,500 years ago, this stretch of what is now hyper-arid desert held a freshwater lake. We know that people came to that lake in at least two main pulses. The earlier group, around 9,700 to 8,200 years ago, were tall, robust fishers and foragers, eating heavily from the water, fish, turtles, crocodiles, supplemented with game and gathered plants. The later group, from about 7,500 to 4,800 years ago, included herders, people whose lives were tied not just to wild animals, but to cattle and other domestic stock. We know they buried their dead with care. Bodies were arranged, not dumped. Grave goods were chosen, not random. There are patterns in orientation, in posture, in which individuals receive ornaments and which do not. We see signs of long lives, healed injuries, arthritis, dental wear. We see in one famous burial cluster the deliberate embracing of a woman and two children, held together by a bed of flowers whose pollen still clings to the sand. Beyond that framework, the questions open up again. Who exactly were these people in genetic and cultural terms? Were the early fishers part of a wider population spread across the Green Sahara, or a relatively localized group with their own distinct traditions? How did the later herders think about themselves? Were they direct descendants, new arrivals, or a mixture? What did their burial rituals mean to them? Did posture signal status, kin group, or beliefs about an afterlife? Were grave goods offerings to the dead markers of identity or messages to the living? Were there songs sung at these graves, gestures repeated generation after generation that we can no longer see? And the timing of their departures remains blurry. Did people leave Gobero in a rapid wave as the lake level crossed some critical threshold? Or did families peel away slowly over centuries, visiting less often, shifting their camps to more reliable water, until one year the last burial was made and no one came back? Future work could change our picture almost overnight. A handful of new radiocarbon dates from carefully chosen bones or charcoal lenses might sharpen the start and end points of each occupation phase by centuries. A new coring project in the basin could refine the lake's level curve, tying specific burials to specific phases of rising or falling water. Improved regional climate records, drawn from lakes, caves, and dust cores across the Sahara, could show whether Gobero's abandonment matched a broad drought pulse or a more local shift. New sites, too, could reframe everything. Another cemetery on a different fossil shoreline, with similar burials but different dates, might reveal migration routes. A rare preserved campsite with floors, hearths and post holes could fill in the missing daily life behind these graves. Even a single well-preserved infant burial with traces of textiles or pigments could complicate our assumptions about identity and ritual. For now, though, we live with the mixture of certainty and unknowing that Gobero offers. We can say with confidence that there was once a green world here, full of lakes and animals and people who are as real as we are. We can trace in outline how climate nudged shorelines, how shorelines guided movements, how movements left these careful pockets of the dead. And we can also admit that the most intimate layers, the sounds of their words, the exact fears and hopes they carried, are probably gone for good. If you've stayed with this story all the way to this quiet edge, you might already be comfortable with that kind of mystery. If you are, and you'd like more long, slow dives into the deep past, it really helps to tap like, leave a comment and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I'd especially love to hear where you're listening from, what your own landscape looks like as you imagine this lost green Sahara. If you want to keep exploring after this ends, there's also the Prehistoric Secrets book I mentioned earlier, with more of these patient puzzles laid out in print. You can find it, along with other episodes and extras, at sleepytimehistory.com. In the end, Gobero's a reminder that landscapes are not fixed stages and that human stories are not guaranteed to last. A place can flip in a few human lifetimes, from lakeshore to desert, from a place where children play at the water's edge to a place where the wind erases footprints in minutes. The people of Gobero lived their lives without knowing that, 9,000 years later, we would be brushing sand from their bones and trying to hear their voices. We, in turn, don't know which of our own lakes, cities or rituals will survive the next great shift. All we can do is pay attention while we are here. Read what traces we can, honour the rest, and accept that most of the past, like most of the future, will always remain just beyond the edge of what the sand allows us to see.